Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band podcast. I am your host, Benedikt, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood. How are you, Malcolm?
Hello, I'm great, Benny. How are you?
I'm great, too. Thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah. How was your weekend?
It was pretty darn good, I gotta say. I just had a lot of fun. Yeah. Yeah, I think things are great.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm a happy camper. It's good. I'm mixing a killer album right now, having a lot of fun with that. And actually, I do have something to talk about. I have an assistant editor working for me right now. I mean, there's like a subcontractor, so it's not like they're really my employee or anything. But when you add somebody to your team, it feels like it's a big thing.
It is. It does, definitely.
I know you've had Thomas, our lovely podcast editor, helping you with projects on the mixing front for a long time now, right?
Yes, yeah, for sure. Like how long do we work together? I think it's over 2 years at this point. He joined the team in late 2019. Crazy.
Yeah. That's totally amazing, and it's so nice having a team to help with, just making things better.
Yeah, for sure.
And run smoother, and yeah, it's so great. So I hooked up with a fellow named Stacy Smyer. I'm sorry, Stacy, if I'm saying your last name right. We've only spoke on like a voice call one time, so everything else is email and Facebook Messenger and stuff like that. But man, Stacy is the bomb. He's just killing it for me. I ended up interviewing a few people and trying out a few people as well. But Stacy just was instantly the problem solver. And ironically, he wanted to do things. No, he didn't want to. How do I say this? I had an idea in my head of how I wanted to do things, how I pictured our workflow working with an assistant if I was to bring one on, and how we'd handle like Pro Tools collaboration and stuff like that. And with Stacy, he's not a Pro Tools user, so like pretty much all of that was not possible. But he just had he was like, oh, well, I can just what about this workflow? What about this? And he just was problem solving. And the other guys I was looking at used Pro Tools, and it was like, okay, they're way easier to integrate with, but this he's got the figure it out attitude.
Yeah,
and I was like, he's the man, he's the guy. And it's been great. So very happy. Yeah, been so lucky with people to help me along the way. Like just an all-star. You can't believe how talented you can find people. I don't know what I'm saying, but essentially,
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, totally. This is really cool. And the whole Brian, my coach that I use as a business coach, and Brian Hood, he's an amazing dude. I think he always calls it the FITFO skill that you need to have, to figure it the fuck out. This is the most important skill you need to have when you want a job in the audio industry or in the creative field in any capacity, I think.
If you just want to do okay at life, I think that's the most important skill.
Yes, exactly. And it's so cool if you work with people who have that, because you don't have to explain every single thing. They often come up with solutions before you even see the problem. This is so cool to have that. So yeah, congrats. That's huge, man. That's really cool. I couldn't imagine working without Thomas at this point, to be honest. Shout out to Thomas, our amazing podcast editor, and my sort of studio. I wouldn't want to call him an assistant anymore at this point. He's like a studio partner. He just works with me on projects, and it's so I couldn't do what I do without him. So I that's a huge thing, dude. That's really cool.
Yeah. It's so stoked.
Amazing. Great to hear that. Also allows you to focus on the things that you are best at, and more on the music, the creative side of things, so it's what we always talk about on this episode as well, is that if you can get rid of the tasks that you don't necessarily need to do yourself, that doesn't mean that those tasks are less important. It just means that somebody else can do them, and sometimes even do them better than you. And if you can focus on what you are really good at, then you can do even better work. So that's why we always tell bands also to distribute roles within the band, and let everybody do whatever they are good at, figure out the strengths and weaknesses of everybody, maybe outsource things that you can't do at all, so that you can focus on the most important thing, which is writing music, performing, maybe production. I don't know. So this is exactly
Editing.
you do exactly what we preach here, what we tell bands to do. You did that yourself now with your business.
Totally. Yeah, it's exactly that. Just here's little things that are it's a technical thing that needs to get done more so than a creative thing a lot of the time. So really, anybody that's diligent and really cares about things being perfect can do the job if they know how. And Stacy's so on it. So it's great. Gets me mixing and making musical decisions quicker, and that's what I want.
Yeah, totally. I'm at this point where I'm pretty sure that Thomas is not even not just capable of doing the things that I could do, but he's like better at them at some level. Like I'm sure I haven't edited much in the past 2 years, for example, and he does nothing but editing and prepping mixes for me. I mean, he does more at this point, but he does a lot of prepping and editing mixes. And when I watch him work, he has got a workflow and some hotkeys and some macros and stuff set up that I don't have. So he's actually faster than I am now. He's just sent me a video a couple of days ago, actually, where I got him a Stream Deck. So I have one and I got him one too. And like a day after he took it home, he sent me a video of him building some crazy multi-action macro whatever thing where he just pushed a button and then the mouse flew over the screen and clicked something and then something else happened and he just immediately built this chain of things that happened on his screen and I was like, yes.
Awesome.
That's awesome. So cool. Yeah, exactly.
Wicked. All right.
Cool. Good to hear that, man. Congrats. Can't wait to hear how this develops and what that enables you to do.
Definitely. All right. Well, that's actually not what we're talking about today, believe it or not.
No, that's not what we're talking about, but it's exciting. So what we're talking about today is something different. But before we dive into that, I want to encourage you to book a coaching call with me because you can do that for free. You can go to theselfrecordingmat.com/call and you can apply for a free coaching call because what we're going to talk about today is something that is very unique to each situation. Like we're going to talk about it in like broad terms, of course, and we give you some actionable advice. But the issue we're talking about is very different from person to person, from band to band. So if you want to address your personal situation and figure out how I can help you with yours, with your problems in regards to that, you can just book a call and I can listen to whatever that sounds like on your side and in your room, and I can give you advice on how to improve that. So now go to theselfrecordingband.com after listening to this episode, selfrecordingband.com/call, book a call with me. And the thing we're going to talk about today is dealing with drum recordings that have been recorded in a small room, but you want them to sound like a big room. So naturally, this is something very unique to each situation, to each space. That's why I encourage you to book a call and talk about it with me in person, because every room is different and your result that you're going for is going to be pretty unique and different too. So some people want a very dry, in-your-face, not ambient sounding drum sound, and other people want a very bombastic, huge sounding drum tone. And it's going to be unique. I have to listen to it. I have to see, hear what your room sounds like, and then I can tell you what you can do about it. What we're going to focus on in this episode today is the latter, where I said you want a bombastic, big sounding drum room, but all you have is the small sort of jam space or practice room, all this recording that somebody made in a small room, and you now have to turn it into something huge. That's what we're going to focus on today. Right. So we're basically turning a small sounding, tight sounding, dry sounding kit into something that sounds like it was recorded in a massive drum room, right?
Yeah, exactly. This is like the voodoo trickery episode.
Exactly. Now, why would you want to do that, or why is that important, or why do we do this anyways? I mean, obviously you want a big room and you don't have one, so that's the main reason. But the reality is also, and this is why we wanted to do this episode, the reality is that amazing sounding tracking rooms are just a luxury, and most people don't have access to those. Like, you might have a big room, but that doesn't mean it sounds really great.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. That's really important, I think, is that we had Band of Rascals, my band, old band, I should say, had a 2,500 square foot warehouse. That was our rehearsal space, and we had the whole damn thing. So it's a very big space. We had a half pipe in there, like for skateboarding and stuff.
That's awesome.
So that's how much extra room we had. We just threw a skate park into it. And we're like, oh, this would sound so huge. And we tried to record in there, and it was unbearably bad. It was just so echoey and live and terrible.
Yep, that's why I said that's what I meant. Sometimes rooms they can be big and you think it sounds massive, but not every big room sounds massive.
Nope.
Or not good.
Yeah, exactly. It sounded plenty big, but just way too big.
Yeah.
In the case of this, something to consider, people, is the decay time of things, and how quickly they stop making noise after you hit them. So you've got that sustain, and in this case, even an echo, and also because of the hard surfaces in that particular environment, like flutter echoes as well. And we kind of had all three. So by the time, if you hit a kick and then a snare and then a kick, the first kick might still be ringing by the time you get to that next kick, and it's just getting muddier. And it's like when you have like the feedback turned up too far on a delay, it just starts becoming worse and worse. It's awful.
Yeah, totally, absolutely. So don't do that. If you even if you have access to a big room, like you might. I mean, no, just don't do it if you're not sure that it's great, because it will not. I was just thinking it will not only affect your room mics, it will also affect the close mics if the room is like that.
Yeah.
So in a room like that, chances are you can't even use the room mics. So the close mics. So in that case, I would probably opt for something smaller and then do what we're going to teach you in this episode and turn that small room into something that sounds massive but controlled.
Yep.
So you need a way to get a great drum tone, even if the room was not ideal. This is what this is about. And I think that's my definition. Not definition, but that's how I view it. Like, I think great drum tone is, I can't talk today for some reason. Great drum tone is usually a combination of to me at least, of the punchy transient you get from the close mics and the length and the sustain and width and depth and character and all that you get from overheads and room mics. So the close mics will be punchy. They have the body. They sound direct and upfront and close. And everything else, the further you get away from the kit, the more length and width and depth you get. And also character, because every room is so unique and you get more of that the further away you go from the kit with the mics. Yeah. And the right combination of all that, that's what a great drum tone is to me. And different blends are appropriate for different genres and tastes, of course. But it's usually the combination of that. So it's not only the mics you put directly on the kit, it's a combination of all those. Now, in a really amazing sounding room, all you need to do is find the right blend and maybe tweak the EQ a little bit and stuff, and you get a great drum tone, but that's not the reality for most people. So we're going to teach you different techniques to get the most out of your close mics and overheads so that they sound a little longer, bigger, more massive, like more vibey and not just pokey small transients. But also we'll show you techniques to create fake room mic tracks if you just don't have a big room to put room mics in. Totally. So there are ways to turn that small sounding kit into something that has been tracked in a huge live room, but in one that sounds controlled, not only huge.
Totally. And I think this is like a little secret, but I would actually prefer to be in that scenario, in the scenario of having a small dead room versus a giant live room that's too live. I think that's a much better place to be in, and to try and fix it from that spot versus the other way around, you're going to be a happy camper.
Yes, absolutely. Totally. Now, the first thing is, and I mean, we kind of addressed it already, we're going to focus on the fake drum rooms thing, or how to turn a small sounding room into a big sounding room. But obviously, you got to ask yourself, do you even want and need the huge sounding room mics? So maybe you're hearing this and you think like, oh, I got to turn our drum kit into this massive thing. But maybe you don't. Like, there are plenty of great productions where there are no room mics used at all. It's just upfront, close mics plus overheads, and it's really dry, and it's the perfect thing for the project. So if that is the case and you dig that sound, then don't worry about this, obviously. You can always experiment, but there's no need for every project to have these huge sounding room mics. Maybe dry is okay. That's the first question, of course, you got to ask yourself. But if you want the massive sounding, huge sounding room mics, then these next things that we're going to talk about are for you.
Yes. Yeah. Dry is okay. It's, again, make those decisions. Make them early.
Yeah. I actually think, I wonder if you agree, Malcolm. I have the impression that right now, currently, a lot of more dry sounding things are released, like in the rock world. Like it's not like there's still the huge room mic thing, but I hear a lot of indie rock or like a lot of also heavier stuff that sounds pretty in your face. There might be a touch of room mics, but it's not this bombastic, long, sustained thing.
Totally.
And some of the stuff is like bone dry sometimes. Like there might be ambient guitars or like long vocal reverbs and stuff, but sometimes combined with like very, very dry drums. Yep. So I hear that more and more now.
It does seem to kind of have come back. I'm currently having like a little phase of like hard gated stuff. And that can be really fun with making it sound like it's a big room, but not giving it the length necessarily, just that kind of ambience, but cutting it off with a gate. That can be really fun.
Yeah, all right. But I think drum rooms will always have a place. So that's why we do this episode. And I love drum rooms. I just love a great sounding drum room. So the first thing I do personally, if I have this very tight, small sounding thing, but I want it to be longer and more roomy, more ambient, all that, more vibey as well. The first thing I try is to manipulate the close mics and the overheads to give me more of that before I reach for a reverb or other techniques that we're going to show you. So what you can do is, and I do that mostly in parallel because I don't want to kill the cool punchy transients that I have. So parallel means instead of like compressing, saturating, or manipulating the close mics in any way on the channel itself, you make a copy of that channel or you send it to an aux, similar to what you would do with a reverb. And then you apply the processing there and blend the processed signal with the dry signal. So that way, the dry, punchy, transient, heavy signal will stay intact, and you can add in the sort of destroyed, mangled signal that you're going to create with compression, saturation, and stuff.
Yeah, so worth mentioning that some plugins have a wet-dry knob right on them as well. Actually, tons do as well.
Yes.
But yeah, there's just different ways you can go about this, and there's advantages to those different ways, but that's another topic.
Totally. I don't know why I always forget about that. I forget about mentioning that because I just like the classic workflow with a separate fader for those things. I rarely use mixed dry knobs ever.
I'm the other way around. I'm almost always a mixed dry knob guy because I'm lazy.
Exactly. I don't know. For my mind, for my brain, it just makes more sense. I always think of it as like what I would do on a console for whatever reason. It's
it makes sense. It totally makes sense. See, we're going down the rabbit hole here, but for me, I've got like this little like mental anxiety around having the same source go to different channels and have the possibility of delay compensation issues, even though there won't be. These computers are good, the technology is solid, but it's like for my own mental anxiety, it's like one thing I don't have to think about, so I avoid it at all costs.
I can see that. And you're a Pro Tools user, so latency compensation has been an issue not too long ago.
Yeah, so it's solved. It's working really great, but it's just a carryover for me.
I can see that. All right, so and what I actually do there on the parallel bus is, or with the mixed dry, whatever you want to do, is pretty heavy compression combined usually with saturation and some transient shaping to get length and sustain out of those close mics and overheads. So what I try to do is I try to kill the transient a little bit, make that less pokey, make that a little more, I want to add length and take away the how do you say that? The spike, make it less spiky. Yes, exactly. Saturation, clipping achieves that. Compression with slow attack time, fast attack times achieves that. Limiting achieves that. You can use a transient designer or some sort of envelope shaper, transient shaper to get rid of some of the attack or to boost the sustain, the length. And when you do that, you create a longer, more less spiky signal with more sustain and all that. It will breathe more. It will have more of the shell tone. It will sound dirtier as well. You get more of the cymbal bleed and that sort of stuff also. So there's that. But then you can blend that sort of destroyed signal with the punchy close mics, and what you'll notice is that it will sound like it has more ambience and more air around it, and it sounds it sounds longer, it sounds fuller. It's the overall average perceived volume goes up. So you have the same peak volume, but the average perceived volume, the loudness goes up. So all of that, but without destroying the transients, which would happen if you would apply a lot of compression on the tracks themselves. So that's why I do it in parallel. That's one way you can start with this.
So when you think about sound, this is worth mentioning, I think. You hit the snare drum, and on that close mic, you're going to hear that, instantly, that big smack. Now, the sound travels from that drum very quickly and hits the room pretty much and activates, and you get your room sound, right? Which is often what we're trying to capture with room mics. But on that close mic, it is hearing that, and it happens after the hit, the sound moves through time. And so there's you might call that pre-delay in a way. It's like built-in pre-delay, which is a feature in a lot of reverb plugins, where you can make the reverb happen a little bit later. And that's kind of happening naturally in a room. The size of the room kind of dictates how fast that happens, actually. But so when you do what Benny just talked about and kind of turn up that sustain, make that sustain louder, you're kind of literally turning up the room ambience. That room that has been activated that split second later is now more present in the mix signal. So it's as if you've added room signal to your direct source.
That is 100% correct. Yep, I agree with everything you just said. Yeah, that's what you do. So that is the first step, and it might also already give you the impression of a bigger room. Then the next thing, and I wonder if you do that as well, Malcolm, the next thing for me that I often try is duplicating the overheads and creating a fake pair of, like a fake small room mic pair from the overhead duplicate. And I'm going to explain in a second how I do that, but do you do that at all?
So I do make fake rooms. I don't know if I always use the overheads though. Okay. And sometimes I do, but they're not always. Yeah. Okay. So yes, but I think this is probably one of those things where there's multiple ways to do it. So yeah, I'm totally stoked to hear what your process is. Because you have,
cool.
You do always have a very natural space around your drums. I really love like the natural sound of your drums in your mixes.
Okay. So thank you.
Maybe this is some secret Benny sauce here.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. So I don't do it on every project, but I actually pretty often try it at least. So what I do is I will duplicate the overhead track, and it works best with overhead tracks where the overheads are more kit mics than just cymbal mics. If they are primarily cymbal mics, then it doesn't work as well. I want a lot of the shells in the overheads to make that work really well. So if that's the case, for example, if it's an XY pair or if there's a mono overhead in the center or something, then that works really well. So I duplicate the overheads. I apply pretty heavy limiting to the duplicate. So I try to get rid of the transient as much as possible. And I use a limiter like the L1 or the Brainworks BX limiter or what it's called. Like some of those trashier sounding limiters that really kill the transient. Mm-hmm. So I want to get rid of the snare and tom transients. I don't want to affect the cymbals too much. So I don't want the weird pumping and artifacts in the cymbals, but I want to even out the snare transients, and I want to add length and like kill the transient a little bit.
Right.
Then I will go in and filter out the, let's say, around 3 to 5K, maybe 2 to 5K, like trashy, sort of harsh cymbal stuff. I don't do a low pass usually. I don't filter the top end entirely. I will make I will scoop out the upper mid range and like with a very broad like filter. But I leave some of the air on top in there. I just feel it sounds more natural to me. If you filter it completely and you put the filter very low, it has this sort of lo-fi sound that I sometimes want, but most of the time I don't. So instead of doing that, I just filter out the harsh stuff. Then I will do maybe another instance of like smoothing out this harsh stuff by using something like Soothe or something, like I really want to get rid of all the nasty cymbal stuff in the overheads, in the duplicates, not the actual overheads.
Yep.
Just because in the next step, I will add heavy saturation or like distortion almost to those mics with something like Decapitator or Devil Lock from Sound Toys works really well. You could apply some soft clipping, like anything. You could try different types of distortion. And if you do that and if you use it heavily, it will create a very sustained, longer, more vibey, more roomy sort of sound, but it will also bring up all the nasty cymbal stuff. So before I hit this thing, I will make sure I get rid of all that because it will come back in anyways with all the saturation and distortion. So that's basically what I do. I kill the transient, I get rid of the nasty cymbal stuff, and then I destroy it with some sort of saturation, distortion, something like that. And usually if I blend that with the overheads, and I do all of that while keeping an eye on the phase. That's very important. So that's also a reason why I don't like to apply a low pass filter, or I also don't use a high pass filter unless I did the same thing on the actual overheads. So I try to duplicate the stuff that manipulates the phase. I know it sounds very complicated at this point, but it's so important because if you blend that back in with your overheads, you don't want to mess with the clarity of your cymbals. You don't want to mess with the actual snare transients if there are some in the actual overheads. So if I use any sort of filter on the actual overheads, I just copy over that same filter to the duplicate, and I try to avoid adding any additional filtering or any drastic stuff on my duplicate that will mess with the phase with my actual overheads. So I keep an eye on that. And if I can't do that for whatever reason, or if the saturation that I'm using messes with the phase, then first of all, I try to flip the phase and see if that solves it. And if it doesn't, I'll just print the fake room mic pair that I created, and I will like line it up with the overheads like visually. I will just print it so I see the waveform, and then I will line it up, and then it will be in phase again. That's just so important. And the last step I do in this process is when I killed the transient, I got rid of the harsh stuff. I brought up what I can bring up by saturating it, all the vibe, all the sustain, all the room sound that is in the signal. I bring that up with the saturation. Then the last step is I typically add an IR of a cool sounding room. Not a reverb, not a long thing, but I add an impulse response to that fake room mic, to that duplicate, to make it sound as if it's been tracked in a room further away from the kit. So I have some pretty amazing IRs that I really like. I have one from Kurt Ballou of his actual tracking room, the God City recording room that I really like the sound of. Cool. That just sounds like a room, not like a reverb, but I love it on drums especially. And I just, for example, take this and see what that sounds like with my fake room mic pair. Or I might compare it with some different ones, but usually that's one of my go-tos. I have my own that I use of my room that I really like. And sometimes I have it like the wet dry thing on the IR. I have that 100% wet oftentimes. So I just get the room sound basically. Cool. And sometimes it's a blend, but oftentimes it's actually really 100% wet. And then usually at this point, I have turned my overheads into a pair of fake room mics that will be a little duller, a little more distant sounding, that will be less punchy, that will have less of a transient, that will be longer. And if I blend that with my typical overheads, my normal overheads, and my close mics, I have a pair of room mics oftentimes.
That's awesome.
I hope that all makes sense. It's hard to explain. I just realized.
Yeah. Well, I've got some questions that'll probably, I'm sure our listeners also have.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And so my process, pretty similar, just to compare notes here. Generally, I am looking, like for room mics, I'm trying to remove the cymbals. I just wish that somehow I could record a drum kit with cymbals, but somehow get the room mic without cymbals. If I could figure that physics out, I'd be a god. Yep. Unfortunately, it's totally impossible. So but it's something I'm always thinking about. Like I'm always trying to make my room mics as dark as possible so that the cymbals are pretty well out of it, like as out of it as they can be, while tracking. And that is actually something I recommend self-recording bands do all the time, because small rooms, the cymbals are really loud in them. So like, you know what I always have luck with? Throwing a room mic on the other side of the door into the studio. It just like, it seems like the lower mids and low end and stuff get through that way better than the cymbals do. So try that out, everyone. It keeps working for me. And every time I recommend it, it also works. So big fan of that. But anyways, so because I'm trying to avoid cymbals in my room mics, I do a similar thing in that I am duplicating stuff or sending them to this is where I do a bus, oddly, rather than a duplicated track. But I tend to send my close mics to it. So I'm sending, my snare, kick, toms, maybe, whatever I want. And I usually do sneak in a little bit of overheads, but just not that much. And then I do the same thing. I just mangle it beyond belief, deharsh whatever I can, often soothe and stuff like that. And and then I distort it. And then I use some kind of reverb or IR to make it sound like it's in a room and farther away, right? And then blend it into taste. And it has been a total lifesaver for some drum sounds. It's just like needed a little bit of space around the kit, and this was the solution. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess your question is why do I use the overheads and how I address the cymbal issue, probably, right?
My real main question was, what IR loader do you use? And we should just quickly explain the IR thing, because we've talked about it on previous episodes, but it is like a more advanced thing. So I think we should just kind of quickly go over that.
Yeah, for sure. First, before I do that, I want to add, before I forget, I want to say something to what you just said. Actually, I don't like just having the shells as room mics in the room. I like the length of cymbals in room mics.
Just a mystery how we get along.
Yeah, totally. Totally. I mean, I'm with you. I totally understand that. I love darker room mics, and I don't want any harshness of the cymbals. I'm not saying that, but I feel every time I hear a drum sound where it's clearly just room samples and not room mics, so the cymbals are just the overheads, but they put like room samples on the close mics, which we'll talk about as well later in this episode. I oftentimes feel it sounds a little disconnected to me. I feel like cymbals in a room and in room mics have a length to them. There's also a sustain, a depth, a width to a cymbal being hit that I love. Like if you crash a ride, for example, it gets this long tail.
Absolutely.
that you don't in an overhead. It sounds more explosive and short, and in the room it sort of builds up, and it's kind of out of control. But I for some reason I just like that if it's just enough, and so I'm actually happy to have the cymbals in there. I just don't want the harsh upper mid-range stuff because that masks the guitars, and it's like, obviously it only works with drummers who know what they're doing. Like if they hit the cymbals way too hard and the shells way too quiet, this doesn't work at all. But if the internal balance is right, then I actually like having the cymbals in there. And I like to keep the top end just because that sounds more expensive to me, and it's usually not as, it doesn't bother me as much, but I want to get rid of everything in like the lower highs, the upper mid-range, all that nasty stuff, as I said. But I want to have some in there. I want to have some of the low end of the cymbals, like with the big cymbals, the ride stuff. And I want to have the shimmer. Yeah, it's a delicate thing, but I kind of like it. So, I kind of like it in there. And with the close mics, that's the final thing here. With the close mics, I do that sometimes, but usually I really do it with the overheads only, just because I feel like they already sound a little more distant. And I don't know, it reminds me more of what room mics sound like to me already, like then compared to close mics. So with close mics, I have the proximity effect. I have a lot of punch and like the direct vibe of it that I just don't have in room mics usually. And with the overheads, it's more balanced. So again, assuming that the drummer hit the shells hard and I have plenty of the actual kit sound in there, it works very well. If that's not the case, I'll have to do it with the close mics because there's just a wimpy like stick attack in the room mics, and that's just not enough. But if I feel like there's the whole drum in the overheads, then it works.
I think this brings up a fun conversation. Room mics, if you're like me, Benny, and most people who have the luxury of recording in a studio with many channels, you probably have more than one room mic up. There's probably a close pair and then a far pair, and sometimes there's a medium pair, and sometimes there's something that's ridiculously just an experiment in a totally different room or whatever. But that is something that I love having, and it's not normally a luxury for self-recording bands, unfortunately, because of channel counts. You can't have both because you need to have all your close mics as well, kind of thing. But they really do different jobs, and I think maybe listeners, that's important to know that like that close mic kind of situation, close room mic, that I would never want there not to be cymbals in that because of what you just said. Like the decay in that, it's full. It's essentially like a easily as important as the overheads to me. They're like just alternative perspective overheads almost.
So glad you bring that up.
Yeah, they're so full sounding. They are the kit in a lot of things. You know, they sound to me most like what I hear when I'm in a room with a drummer, right? So that's incredibly important. But again, you can't always have that. Where the far thing, that doesn't sound like we hear drums. It sounds unnatural, but it's got this ridiculously cool when the levee breaks kind of thing going on. With a huge, giant decay. I think stadium rock, just like larger than life. And that's kind of like, that's when I want no cymbals. That's when I want just like these giant, huge shells. Also, there's a song that has my most samples in it, the Riser you said, and I still haven't checked that out. I wanna
Shit, I totally forgot to send that to you. Yeah, I'm gonna do that. Make a note.
That just reminded me making drum noises yet again. But in the close room pair, that is, I think they're just different jobs for different reasons. And the reason I'm bringing it up now is that our listeners should be thinking about what they need to be prioritizing when they're recording their drums. Do they need to make sure they have that long, far away mic for explosive shells, or do they need glue for that close room pair?
Yeah, agreed. So I think we can actually be friends again.
Glad we sorted that out.
Totally. So you're right. Totally agree. We should have talked about that in the beginning. I'm so glad you brought that up. Yeah, there's the concept of close mics, close room mics and far room mics usually, and everything you just said. So that's exactly how I see it as well. You've probably seen, when you look at like studio pictures, you've probably seen a pair of mics pretty close to the kit in front of the kit. Like some people call it front of kit mics, some people call them close room mics, whatever. Oftentimes it's like a stereo microphone. Like there's these big stereo ribbon microphones, for example, that give you a cool stereo picture of the kit. And they are almost, as you said, like a second pair of overheads. It's basically, what you would hear if you were standing in the same room with the drummer. It's the most realistic sounding thing where you want to have the full picture of the song. So that's exactly that. And that's sort of what I'm after when I do the fake rooms duplicate overheads thing, because that will never sound like the big explosive Led Zeppelin thing. Totally. It will be more of a little bit more sustain, a little bit more vibe, a little bit more depth, So this is actually creating a fake pair of close room mics.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Now
that's so fantastic. Yeah. And you mentioned you don't do this on every mix. And then I told you what I do with the direct shells. And I would say I do that a couple times a year. Like it's very rare, very, very, very rare, because I think the next thing we're going to talk about is way more effective at doing what I was trying to accomplish.
Totally.
But before we get into that, you got to wait, listeners. We should talk about the IRs. We shouldn't skip that.
For sure.
So in a nutshell, IRs are impulse responses. So they kind of mimic the reaction a room would have if you played a sound in it. So it's like transporting your drums into a different room. It's pretty magical. There's also speaker impulse responses, which we've talked about a lot, which I'm having a lot of fun with Benny lately. You keep convincing me to keep messing with them, and I keep liking it.
Awesome. Great to hear.
But yeah, so now IRs versus reverb. What's going on there?
IRs versus reverb. Yeah, so I use, because you asked me which IR loader I used. I use the stock Cubase one for that purpose, not for guitar IRs, but for that purpose. It's called Reference, I think, or like Reverence with a V, because of reverb. Reverence. It's a Cubase IR loader, and IR stands for impulse response. It's sort of a snapshot of the characteristics of the room or a piece of gear. So basically, you create an IR by sending a test tone, like a small blip of white noise or pink noise or a clap or whatever you want to use. Usually it's like a broadband thing, like a white noise or pink noise thing. You send a very, very short impulse of that, a very short blip into a room. You record that, then you cut off the transient. You end up with a WAV file without the transient that just gives you the reflections, the decay, and the frequency response of the room, the natural response of the room. And then you can put that WAV file into an impulse response plugin loader that turns that into an impulse response. So that's one way to do it. You can just load WAV files into those. It's a very simple way that I just described. There's a better way to do that, but it could work like that. I actually went into rooms just clapping, cut off the clap transient, and just put the wave of the decay that I got into an impulse loader, and it works pretty well. So
crazy.
What it sounds like totally depends on the signal you send into the room, obviously, and it works best with a broadband thing, like a white noise or something. But even just walking into a room and clapping could give you an IR that you can use. And there are tons of IRs that you can just buy and load up. So long story short, it's not an algorithm or like a programmed thing that mimics a room. It's an actual snapshot, a recording of the behavior of a room. And you can reuse that in your session and put it on whatever you want to put it on. So you can capture the sound of a room and then use it in your session. That's what it is. It's similar to how you can capture the sound of a guitar cab and then use it with different amps. It's the same concept. You can do that with every sort of piece of gear, as long as it's not time-based. Like you can't do that with, I don't know, compression, for example, because it changes with, it's like, it doesn't work. But any static thing, like an EQ curve, a cab, some sort of, different sort of types of effects, gear, and then obviously rooms. You can just do that. And that's the difference to a reverb to me, is that it sounds more like an actual room, because it is an actual room in most cases. So my rule of thumb is whenever I want to have the sound of an actual room, I try an IR, and whenever I want to have something larger than life or something that sounds like an effect, I reach for a reverb. And then I want to make it sound like a reverb, like a plate or something. But I rarely use reverb to create the illusion of a room. There are exceptions, though, and I want to talk about that really quickly, because I know that most people, when they think about turning a small-sounding drum kit into something bigger, they think reverb. That's the natural thing to do, I think, that you reach for a reverb, you add it to the drums, and then you think it sounds like a bigger room. The thing is, as I just said, most reverbs sound like reverb and not like a natural room. Even if you use an ambience patch, like an ambience preset or something, it still sort of doesn't sound natural. There are a couple of exceptions, though, that work. So there is, for example, there are some room presets or like patches on certain types of reverb gear that actually work for me. So, for example, there's the Bricasti, what's it called? The M7 or no? What's the...
Maybe it is M7. That sounded right.
I think so. Like the famous precasti sort of reverb. And there's this reverb, what's it called? The Slate one, the one reverb plugin that has all of them. I don't even know what it's called. I use it all the time, but I can't remember what it's called. Like Slate Digital has this reverb plugin that sort of has a model of every sort of effects thing ever made in one plugin. It's actually really, really great. And there's a precasti model in there. And in that precasti model, there are some rooms that actually sound like rooms to me. So this is an exception that I sometimes use. But hear me out. What you need to do in order for that to work, at least in my opinion, is you need to do that properly. And what I mean by that is most people EQ their kicks and their snares and their toms and all of that. And then they send those processed signals into some reverb. And then it sounds like a reverb and it sounds totally fake. Right. So what I think you have to do is you have to send it pre your processing, whatever you do. You have to take the raw snare, for example, and send that to the reverb. And then you do your processing, your EQing, and your compression, not on the thing that you send to the reverb. And that way, because think about it, you have a raw snare drum. It's probably going to have a lot of mid-range. You want to add more bottom, more body. You want to add more top end to it to make it cut through the mix better. You do all that, and then you send it to the reverb, and what you get is you get this weird-sounding top-end heavy thing that just doesn't sound like a room. If you duplicate the snare drum and use one of those to just send it to the reverb, but not to your actual drum mix, so you pull down the fader, make a pre-fader send to your reverb, don't use it in the mix, only for the reverb send, and then you process the dry one, and you don't send that one to the reverb, then you can add all the top end you want, all the bottom end you want. You can compress it, you can distort it, can do all sorts of things to make it sound modern and punchy, but you'll have this natural sounding snare feeding the reverb, which will sound much more like an actual room. Because in room mics, the room mics would hear the natural snare, not the processed one.
Right.
So that is my thought process. So to me, that always sounds much better than sending the processed thing into the reverb, unless you want it to sound like an effect, like a reverb. Right. Then, of course, send the processed one into it. So if you want an obvious like plate that is like, larger than life, heavy and whatnot, then send the processed thing into it. But if you want to create the illusion of a room, try sending the unprocessed drums into that. That's just what I wanted to say, yeah.
Yeah, no, I like that. I don't really do it that way, but I would say that I always end up mixing the reverb signal, like EQing it or whatever needs to be done to it, because, so maybe you're just taking care of that a step earlier. So I like that idea. I'm going to try it. Absolutely.
Yeah, you can totally do what you just said. You can totally go into the reverb's return and just EQ it and get rid of the unnatural like top end stuff that you boosted. But yeah, you can do that. I just like the other approach a little bit better, and I might still EQ it. I might still take out some of the top end and the cymbal bleed and the reverb. So EQing reverb is also very important here, I think. Yeah, but there's like many ways that lead to the same sort of result. I'm just saying that a lot of people are just lazy and put the reverb on their processed snare drum, and then you can totally hear that. So you have to EQ it, or you have to use the dry signal, or you have to do both. But you have to make sure that the reverb sounds like a room if you want to create that illusion.
Absolutely. Yeah. Lots of experimenting, trying to find the right reverb that actually sounds okay. And yeah, room IRs are a really cool way to go. I'm really loving how much more real they sound these days. Yeah. It's really nice. Okay. So the next thing would be using drum room samples. So these are drum samples, just like you've probably come across by now. I think everybody who's not living under a rock has encountered drum samples at this point in their career. But they are not the close mic necessarily. They are, a capture of the room sound of a snare drum or the room sound of a kick or a tom or whatever you want. And you blend that in to augment your drum to give it a room sound. So you might only, especially as a self-recording band, only have close mics, depending on your channel availability and mic. And, maybe you just don't have a room like we're talking about in this exact episode that could give you a room sound. So you can just find a drum room sample and blend it in. And this can be awesome. It really can be. And it can be something I do even when I record giant sounding drum rooms, because it's like, oh, I have a different room available for this. It's something you can have in just for parts of the song. You can just be like, okay, the last chorus has a giant room, the rest doesn't, if that's what the song calls for. So it's a lot of power and flexibility. Don't get me wrong, it doesn't sound the same as the real thing. Doesn't always sound worse though.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. That's my favorite approach, to be honest. I love great sounding room samples. It always sounds the most natural to me. It's just, I don't have room mics. Okay, so I'm going to trigger some and we're good to go. And if you pick the right ones, they totally sound natural to me.
Yep.
It's just, I think it's important to be careful with the tuning and they chose a certain type of drum to make the drum samples. And if you want it to be really natural and to blend well, it's a good idea to choose something that is in a similar tuning range and it just blends well. So, I mean, I've talked about it often on this podcast. I personally just love room sound samples, like the company room sound. I just love their sample libraries, and I love them because of the room mics, most importantly, because compared to like Superior Drummer, I mean, they have great ones as well, but like compared to a lot of other, and I don't want to say anything bad about any other drum sample libraries, but compared to most other libraries, they don't sound as massive. They sound more real, natural to me. They are smaller rooms that still sound cool. If you compress them a lot, you can bring up a lot of ambience, but they sound like a room, like a natural ambience. That's what I love about them. And the funny thing about these libraries that I like there is that there is always a snare drum, and I pretty much find that with like 2 or 3 clicks, like there's always a snare drum that sounds exactly like the one that I have in front of me. It's really weird how that works. Like Thomas and I have laughed about that a lot, where I was like, I open up the Bober Gel library, I like try 2 or 3 snare drums, and then I'm like, boom, listen to that. That's exactly the one that we have in our session here. It sounds like the same thing. It's crazy. I don't even have to do anything to it. It just blends naturally. Sometimes I open like the J Moz library or something. Like I know them so well by now that I hear a snare drum and I'm like, okay, that's the one from J Moz. I pull it up, I load it in, and it's the same thing. And it's weird how that works with those libraries. It only works with those for whatever reason. For me, it's really crazy. And if you pick the right snare and maybe you detune it a little bit lower or higher or something at the right toms, and then you solo the room mics only, it sounds as if it belongs to the kit. It's like just a matter of picking the right sample for the job. And there are, of course, great sounding one-shots and stuff for, I don't know, Slate Trigger and other things. So whatever you use, just make sure that you're triggering something that actually blends well with what you have there with the close mic. It doesn't have to be the same thing. Sometimes a weird different snare works. Just make sure that it works. Like I've used room samples of really high-pitched snares combined with a very low-pitched close mic, and it worked. But you have to just listen whether or not it works, and sometimes it just doesn't.
Yeah. Picking samples is one of my favorite parts of mixing. I know there's some mixers that hand that off to their assistants. Do you do that?
Not yet. We sort of started doing that. Thomas is really good at doing that. He programs drums for me when like people just send over like a scratch drum track and they want better drums. Then Thomas is a drummer, so he's naturally really good at that. So he can program drums that sound really awesome. And with triggering, we didn't do it because he always adjusts the MIDI and creates MIDI, adjusts the MIDI, and sets everything up so that I can choose the samples. For some reason, I always wanted to be the one who chooses the samples just because I like it so much and because I want to make that decision. But we were talking about handing that off to him, and we just started getting him the same drum sample libraries that I have, so we can collaborate better. But yeah, like something in me wants to choose the samples.
Yeah, it's so fun. It's amazing. Sometimes it's like instantly you're like, this is amazing. This works amazing. This works amazing. Sometimes it's like, none of these are doing it. What? Like none of these are going to fit. And you can take a while to kind of like find the right ingredients for your drum soup. But it's always like a really rewarding process. And I feel like even by doing it, even when I'm not really finding something that's jiving, it's getting me thinking about what's happening in the drum sound already and maybe why it's not fitting. And it's like, okay, I need to figure out some decay times on these shells so that I can blend something in with it to fatten it up. It's such a kind of like, it's very explorative. It's totally good fun. Totally. And yeah, something I use a lot as well. Generally, like with compression and usually there is some overheads and room mics available with what gets sent to me. So creating a fake room isn't usually the go-to, but it like we've said, it is sometimes. So, but these drum room samples are something that are pretty common for me to sneak into a mix.
Almost every single mix I do, actually. Very, very common. I don't always use close mic samples, actually, but I almost always use drum room samples because most rooms just suck. It's the reality. That's the reason for this episode. Most real drum rooms suck, including my own, although it's a real studio. Like, I have a great sounding room next to my live room, but I have a small actual live room that is very dry and doesn't give me a great explosive drum room sound. So if I want that, I can use the room next door or trigger great sounding room samples. So that's, yeah. So yeah, I do it on every mix almost. And that I think what we need to explain real quick is that we're talking about room samples only in this case. So I think most people view drum samples as this one thing that's usually a blend of the close mic, the overheads, and the room. And depending on what you use, with most samplers, you can solo these channels and treat them like individual mics. So you can only use the overheads or only use the drum rooms, or you can only use the snare close mic. And even with trigger, there are one-shot samples. If you use Slate Trigger, for example, there are one-shot samples that have everything baked into one sample, so there you have no control. But then there are packs that give you the close mic, the snare bottom, snare top, whatever, the close rooms, the far rooms, or whatever. And you can use all of them. You can make your own blend. You can use a pre-made blend that they often give you, or you can just use a pair of those and only trigger those. That's what we're talking about here. And I think that not too many people do that, actually. Or I've seen a lot of the artists that I'm working with where I request room mics when they program drums, for example, and they don't send me room mics. I'm like, in the library you used, is there a pair of room mics? And they often are like, yeah, but I didn't think we need those or whatever, or I didn't know how to get it out of the sampler, and so I just muted them or whatever. And then I have to tell them that you can set up multi-output routing and export all the individual things, and so I just know that a lot of people are not aware that you can have them on separate tracks and treat them like microphones, or you can exclusively use the room mic portion of a drum sample and not use the close mics at all.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. There's two schools of thoughts on this, it seems, and there's no wrong answer. Like, I know great mixers who want their drum samples just to be like one and done. It's a finished drum sound kind of thing. I'm much more like pieces. I'm like, I grab something for the thunk, and I grab something for the and something for the transient. It's like pieces, little pieces. And like, honestly, it's not uncommon for me to be running like 4 samples just on like my kick or my snare mixed with my close mics as well, so like there's like 6 snare tracks. It's like enormous, but they're all doing little tiny jobs. Some of them are turned down just so far, but I think they're important. Yes. And then the automation of like being able to bring them up for certain moments and stuff it's so powerful. And we are totally off topic now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but you're totally right. Like, when you do that though, keep an eye on the phase, as always, the polarity and the phase relationship.
It's a lot of work doing it this way.
Yep. But you're right. Like, a lot of people do it that way, myself included, and you do it too. So yeah, totally. All right. I think you got the concept. A quick recap up to this point, and then we move on. So creating fake rooms from enhancing the close mics first, then creating fake rooms from what you have, the overheads or close mics or both, then using IRs and or reverb to create the illusion of a room, and then using actual room samples to add what is missing in the recording and just give you a pair of room mics that you don't have in whatever you have recorded. So the next thing you can do, I mean, these things that we just mentioned are usually enough. Like, you can get a great sounding drum tone, drum sound, and drum room sound from doing all of the stuff that we've been talking about, or from just doing some of it. That is usually enough. But there are 2 additional things that we want to tell you about. The first thing is what I call reamping drum rooms. It's not really reamping. It's just, for lack of a better term. So what I do is I'll send drum close mics, typically with a little bit of cymbals, depending on if I want to create close room mics or far room mics, as we've discussed before. I send a blend of room mics out of the computer into a speaker, and that speaker will send that drum mix into a room that I think sounds great, and then I will just set up mics and capture the room. So I have a pre-recorded dry drum kit. I create a blend of the things that I want in my room mics. I send that into a room, turn it up loud, and then record it as if they were room mics. And you can take a mobile setup to some cool sounding room or I don't know, like whatever you have, and try and see if that works. That's not something I do in every mix, obviously, but I've done it before because I know my room pretty well. And sometimes I'm like, okay, I think the characteristic of my drum room would work well here. And if that's the case, I have a quick way of just sending it out into my room. There's a speaker set up there, and then I can quickly set up a pair of mics, record it back in, see if it works, and then I have my room mics. Sometimes it doesn't work. It's not something I do all the time, but it's something that's a fun thing to do, I think. Yeah. And you not only to create room mics, but to add some unique character, to add the vibe of a certain room to your drum mix.
Totally. Yeah. It's super cool and fun and creative to do. Very low on like the list of like first steps,
Yes.
Like everything we mentioned I would try first because it's a lot of work, but it's also pretty cool. It could be unique, kind of makes the process fun as well. Yeah. It's going to be a good time.
Yeah. Do you know the thing with, like, it's totally off topic, but it's also very quick. Do you know the creating a fake snare bottom mic thing that some people do? Where you just put a speaker driver, like not the whole, you can use a whole speaker, but you can just put the driver, like a speaker on top of a snare drum, send the snare into that, and then it triggers the snare drum, and you put a mic underneath it, and then you have your snare bottom that you didn't have before.
Right. That's so cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So it works with any sort of speaker. You just need an impulse, basically, that's triggered off the snare drum. Just some impulse that like activates the snare.
Splats into it. Yeah.
Yes. And then you put a mic underneath it, and then you have your snare bottom that you didn't have before. That's actually very dynamic and natural sounding.
That's hilariously awesome. Yep.
Yeah.
Love it. That's great. That's totally great. There you go. Marcus, the drummer in Band of Rascals and co-hosts my other podcast, he just on the weekend was messaging me. He was like, I want to get spring reverb on my drums. Can I send out into my amp? I was like, sure. Yeah, go for it. Do it. And he said it was super cool. It turned out great.
Yeah, exactly.
So the sky's the limit with reamping.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. And then the last point here. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to kind of go full circle, in my head, when I use things like ERs, man, we're on a roll today.
Yep.
Mondays. All right. When we use things like IRs, room IRs, and send, specific things into it and, distort them and stuff like that, I think of that as reamping. We're just reamping in the box. In my head, it's the same thing. It's just easier.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if but when I think about it, it's kind of the same thing. Yeah, I send something into a room and then capture it, which is what you do with IRs. Basically, you just do it inside the box. Yeah, totally. All right. The last thing here on our list is something you need to talk about, because that is something I don't do very often, and I'm curious to hear how you exactly do it.
Cool. All right. So sometimes when you get a room mic, some of it sounds cool, but some of it doesn't. So that could be that the kick is just like slappy terribleness or something, or like the snare sound. Yeah, like often for me, actually, I find that the snare sounds cool, but there's too much cymbals, or the kick like doesn't sound good once I've mangled the snare into shape. Often with room mics, we're really destroying them. So it might be distorting, like literally distorting and compressing the snot out of it. And that makes the snare sound awesome, but everything else has just gone to hell. What we can do then is hard gate them, essentially. So we've talked about key spikes, I'm sure, but the quick version is that just like we would use for drum samples, we create little MIDI spikes or audio blips to trigger drum samples of. And you can also use these to control things like gates and compressors. So in this case, we're using key spikes. Let's stick with the snare, for example. We got key spikes for each snare hit. We're sending that, and it's telling the gate on my room mic to let audio through only when these blips are happening. So only when the snare gets hit, the room mic plays sound now. And you can it's like kind of creating your own drum room sample, I think of it, where you don't have the whole kit anymore. You've just got one drum coming through, but you can really mangle it and just focus on that one drum. And the bleed that would have been there is now gone, unless it's being hit, kind of thing. It is something I do surprisingly often. It's never really worked for me as like a very forward in the mix thing. It's always like more of like a white noise blast to reinforce a drum almost. It's like it's really crappy sounding on its own. But I can find you can get like a lot of like an impact timed up with either the kick or the snare in particular. And it's pretty fun.
Awesome. Yeah, I love it. So yeah, you kind of answered the question already that I had in mind. But so the way I understand it is you, by saying you'll only let the good stuff through, you mean that you trigger it only off those things. Like if you like the snare, you trigger you trigger the gate off the snare. Like you let the gate open whenever the snare hits. So you don't necessarily just do that on a certain like limited bandwidth, like part of the frequency spectrum, for example, because you could do that. You could sidechain something like Pro MB or like a multiband expander thing to just open up the whatever high mids, low mids, whatever.
Right.
So you don't really do that. You do it full bandwidth, like broadband, but only off the whatever shell you want to reinforce.
Yeah. I mean, I usually have EQ'd it heavily, so like the high end, even high mids are like eliminated because there's so much cymbal bleed often. And I try and leave as much as I can in, really. But if it's, if every time the snare happens, there's this weird like cymbal thing, that's not worth it for me, right? So I really just take whatever I can get. And sometimes it's very little.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's like this unbelievably narrow sounding little splat. But it can really be worth it. And it does sound like, the one thing I would say is that it always sounds totally unique to me. It's like no self-respective drum sample maker is going to put out that sound, like it sounds awful on its own. They would never be able to sell it, but it fits the drum kit because it's part of it. It's real. So I never really have trouble making it fit.
Awesome.
And yeah, it's sometimes in my case, I'm like duplicating the room track and then doing this to it for each instance that I want. So like I'll have one that's triggered from the snare, and then I duplicate it again if I also want the kick and have it being triggered by the kick key spikes. So they're their own independent things happening. Sometimes I will have the gate depth not go all the way, so the depth is how low the volume is when it's not open. And sometimes it's like I don't want to lose the whole drum kit, but I just want the snares to be much louder than everything else. So it's like quiet, gets louder when the snare gets hit, and then it's quiet again. And that can sound more natural as well. There's a lot of power. Key spikes are awesome.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's great. Love it. I need to do it more, I think, because again, it's a more natural way of doing it, and which I always love. So I need to explore that more. I don't know why I don't do that so often. I just rely on drum room samples so heavily because I love them so much. And but yeah, that's actually a cool thing. I need to try.
Yeah, it can be a lot of fun.
Great. All right. By the way, if you want to try the room sound drum samples that I mentioned, if you go to the selfrecordingband.com/105, it's going to be the show notes page for this episode. And on there, you'll find a link to Room Sound. This is going to be an affiliate link. So if you buy through that link, I'm going to get a small portion of their revenue, the amount of the sale. So it doesn't cost any extra to you. It's just a way of supporting us with the podcast, or supporting me more precisely in this case. And I just want to say it. Yeah, I just want to say it because it costs you the exact same amount as if you would go to the website. But that way you can support me. So if you want to try those out, if you want to buy those, please go to my website, buy it through that link. And while you're there, you can apply for a coaching session, as I said in the beginning. So you'll also find a call to action to apply for a one-on-one call with me, a free call, because as you've heard, this is a pretty complex topic, and I have no idea which of those things is the right thing to do in your situation. But I will be able to tell you if I hear your drum recordings. I will have an idea of what to do with those and how to achieve what you have in your head when it comes to drum tone. So just book a session with me, send me the stuff that you've recorded, and I will walk you through some things that I would do to those drums to make them sound more massive, even if your drum room doesn't sound massive the way it is right now. So go to the selfrecordingband.com/call, or just to the show notes page of this episode, and you'll find a call to action there, and you can just book a call with me, and then we'll talk about that.
Yeah, take them up on that. You've got a sound in your head and you don't know how to get there. This is like an opportunity to make it happen.
For sure. All right. Hope this was too complicated. I felt like we went...
went deep. We went down every rabbit hole we could find, even though we specifically said before we started that we wouldn't do that.
I'm so bad at that, honestly.
Get Benny and Malcolm talking about drum sounds, and what did we think was going to happen?
Yeah, exactly. All right, hope this was helpful still. By the way, I would love to hear what you think of those kind of episodes. If you could share that in our community, like if you are in the Software Coding Band community on Facebook, I would love to hear whether or not you enjoy these longer, more in-depth episodes where we go down these rabbit holes. Because if the most of our listeners are like, well, this is way too complicated, I can't follow along, I don't get what they're saying, then there's no reason for us to do these episodes. But if you actually like it and you want that, like to go deep like that every once in a while, then just let us know. I'd be really curious to learn that, actually, because I don't really know. And for us, it's fun to talk about stuff like that, but it doesn't make sense if like 90% of our audience doesn't have an idea of what we actually do here. So.
Yeah. We want you to actually get something out of these episodes other than like our favorite. Yeah, I don't even know what I'm saying, but
it's Mondays. Maybe I sometimes I wonder if Mondays is the right time to record an episode.
Yeah.
All right. Anyway, thank you for listening. Talk to you next week.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.